Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of Receivables Roundtable. Today, I am talking with my friend, Mr. Ben Johnson from Cornerstone. Cornerstone is a licensing organization. And how you doing today, Ben?
Doing all right. How about yourself?
I cannot complain. Just for a little bit of background for everybody, I've actually had the opportunity to meet Ben at, I want to say, 1,000 different conferences over the past decade or so, and always been just a very informative person when it came to the insurance side of the world and kind of directing me and answering my more detailed questions. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about cyber policies and kind of what the cyber side of the world looks like. As a crypto investor, I'm highly interested in this subject. But as a debt buyer, agency consultant and law firm consultant, I also have a lot of interest in that area as well. So let's kick it off today, Ben, by maybe you could just tell everybody a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do over at Cornerstone.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, we do licensing, insurance, surety bonding. We've been offering insurance products to the arm industry for a little over 15 years. And back 15 years plus, the main hot button topic, and really still is, of course, was errors and omissions coverage to defend FDCPA claims, TCPA, FCRA, that sort of thing. And obviously, this past few weeks has been no different with the 11th Circuit decision. But over the years, cyber liability has become an increasingly important topic. 15 years back, most of our industry didn't carry cyber liability at all. And if you did see it, it was maybe a sort of a limited network security endorsement on an E&O policy or maybe a different policy. But now a lot of people are looking at buying separate cyber liability coverage, both A, because of the threats and kind of forward thinking, and then also B, because of client contract requirements as well. And so that's something that we're fielding a lot of questions about. Obviously, it's a really evolving product because the cyber threats are evolving as well. And I know that's something that you see in the news every day, not just in the arm industry, but financial services and others as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the cyber threats are evolving on a daily basis. I can definitely attest to that because I'm reading that news and helping to defend against that from a technology perspective. So having a little
Right.
insurance behind that doesn't hurt, especially with all the ransomware attacks. And I mean, the evolution of cyber attacks over the last 15 years, you never know what you're going to see tomorrow.
That's right. And, for years, we've been kind of trumpeting about the high number of consumer records that the arm industry stores, and really encouraging everyone that we talk to do whatever you can to pare down those records, right? It's the PII, the personally identifiable information. So you're talking about date of birth, social, payment card information, that sort of thing. Our industry historically has stored tremendous amounts of these records. And there was a time, years ago or decades ago, that was considered a positive, right? Aggregating data, helped show that you were an established, experienced agency. And so in recent years, we've seen the thinking evolve on that particular subject. And now I think most agency owners are understanding that those records are now really a liability. You don't want to hold on to them any longer than you have to. And I'm just encouraging contacts in the industry to do whatever you can to offload old files that you're not working anymore, get them partitioned off, get them archived,
get them offline,
just unplugged. That's right, unplugged on on an external hard drive if possible.
If you got to store them, cold storage is the way to go. But let's talk for a second about
right.
Why. Right? Like, why do we want to pare down these records? It's my understanding that our objective is because of, if there is a breach or you were to leak that data, that your responsibilities to those consumers are amplified on a per account basis, the fines that you pay, right? The damages
Right.
that happen are going to happen on a per record basis. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's right. I mean, there is a value to each consumer's information
Mm,
on the black market. And so organized crime rings are mining for these large batches of files, and then they will try to sell them. Well, then you have to figure out how to comply with all 50 states, which each have their own separate notification laws.
mhm.
And so it's a tremendous amount of detail and a tremendous amount of expense for the notification. And that's something that a cyber liability insurance policy would help you with, both knowing how to respond and also possibly covering the costs of the breach notification itself.
Mhm.
And that's something, though, that we've been kind of focusing on the record counts and data breaches. What we have seen in the last year, especially, is a shift in the attacks. And so now it's been moving from dwelling on your server and mining for those accounts, like we talked about, to now really it's just very quickly hacking in and demanding a ransom to be paid in order to get back into your server. And so we're seeing uh, the criminals, with what we call threat actors, really change up their game plan.
Mhm.
Part of it's due to, you know, uh, companies have gotten better at detecting threats.
Mhm.
So it maybe has gotten a little less profitable for them to try to mine the data. I think a lot of companies have worked at archiving the old records. And so now they've figured out that the low hanging fruit is the ransomware attack.
Mhm.
And we saw over the past year, I believe ransomware attacks were up somewhere in the vicinity of 700%
Mhm.
as
I've seen
companies
that
move
number.
to a more, yeah, as companies move to a more remote work from home model.
Mhm.
And so now the ransomware as coverage on a cyber policy has become absolutely as important as that breach notification expense that we've been focusing on for many years.
It's really interesting, and I've actually handled a few of those ransomware attacks as they've come across the industry, and even outside the
Yeah,
industry in terms of creditors and assisting defending archiving those platforms and seeing how to limit those attacks. And in some instances, there's really just not a lot you can do. It depends on how good the hackers are on the other side, and kind of their country of origin. I mean, there's so many different factors that come into play, and especially as cryptocurrency volumes and values have continued to rise. I think it's become even more complex in terms of how they're able to mask themselves in terms
that's
of
right.
accepting those payments. And it's not like it's not like you're going to throw a duffel bag of cash over a bridge like in a movie. I mean, they're looking for a
Right.
crypto transfer. And
Right.
so it's a little harder to track, a little harder to deal with, but I think a very interesting kind of evolution in terms of how those attacks have been monetized.
That's right. And, all of those things that you just described, it's a very complex process. It's
Mhm.
not something that you want to just kind of wing and figure it out on the fly.
Mm-mm.
That's where cyber liability comes in, and they will appoint an expert law firm to deal with the forensics, to contain the breach, to
Mhm.
deal with the actual negotiations, and if necessary, the possible payment of the ransom as well. I spoke with David Sherman, who's an attorney with Baker Hostetler, and that's part of what their area of expertise is. He said that they've seen their average ransom payouts increased from about 300,000 on average last year to over 700,000 on the average ransom payout just in
Wow.
the course of 1 year. So not only are the attacks on the rise, so, significantly, but also the dollar amount of the payments has gone up tremendously as well.
I've been hearing the same thing because the attorney that I generally go to for my know-how when it comes to these types of cyber attacks is Martin Tully with Actuate Law, just because of his breadth of experience, and I believe he sits on the Sedona Council and some
Sure.
other. He's very well plugged in there, and the same. He was saying the same thing at RMAI this year that we're just seeing increases, right? Like there's more attacks out there, and there's new ways of doing it. So as we kind of talk about these cyber policies, I'm assuming you guys have had some clients that have actually had to exercise these policies. It's not just something that they're buying and sitting on, but some people have actually had to use this.
That's right. That's right. And it's, you know, what I've seen is, on the E&O side, there are nuisance FDCPA claims, right? And there are kind of smaller claims that you can handle yourself and you can settle it and make it go away for a few $1,000s.
Mm.
Unfortunately, on the cyber side, the claims, although much fewer in number, have a higher dollar value. There aren't really little fender bender type claims. If you've got a cyber incident, it's probably going to be a
You've got
pretty
an
big
incident.
deal. That's right. And so, that's what we've seen, the numbers in general across all industries, but we're certainly seeing that bear out in the arm industry as well. And we have seen some cyber ransomware attacks.
Mhm.
Um, and so, it's something to try to be vigilant about, but certainly you need to make sure the insurance coverage is buttoned up so that you're ready to respond quickly in the event of an incident.
Well, let's talk about some of that insurance coverage, right? Because you are one of the foremost experts in the space on, how to shop for one of these policies and what does it all mean. So, short of just pitching an individual policy here, what I'd like to do is give people a better understanding of the criteria that they should be considering when shopping for a policy. So can we talk
Right.
a little bit about like what are the building blocks of a good cyber insurance policy?
Sure. And I mentioned kind of the bare bones network security endorsements that used to be tacked on to the E&O policies. It was just a very minimal, I would describe it as just defense,
Mhm.
some liability defense in the event of a breach. I've always felt like those endorsements do more harm than good because they almost give you a false sense of security
Mhm.
while not really covering very much in the event of a breach. Unfortunately, most E&O carriers are no longer adding those network endorsements on
Mhm.
because you really do need a separate standalone cyber policy. And I've always harped on, look for, there are some line items. Usually the quotes are pretty easy to read,
Mhm.
but you're going to look for a line item that says breach notification expense, or it might say breach mitigation. That's going to be the cost of notifying those consumers, like we talked about in the various states where they may reside. And so you want to make sure that number is as high as possible. Hopefully, it's the full limit amount. But now, as we talked about with ransomware being such a threat, there's going to be a separate line item for ransomware as well. And you want to make sure that that is a high number. Hopefully, it's the full policy limit as well. They may use the term cyber extortion is how it's commonly noted on a cyber quote, but that's something you're going to want to look for as well.
Interesting.
Uh, and then another thing we haven't even really talked about it that's also on the rise is phishing, right? They call it
Mhm.
social engineering,
Mhm.
where they create a fake email address that really looks a lot like your boss's email and says, "Hey, I need you to wire these funds to this client or this individual right away." Um, you're not going to get full limit coverage for that because the exposure is so high.
Sure.
Uh, these days, you're doing pretty well if you can get a $250,000 sublimit for the social engineering
Okay. Sounds
phishing
like
incidents.
everybody needs to read The Art of Deception by Kevin Mitnick, where they go
Right.
through some really detailed methods that are being used from a social engineering perspective. I actually read that
Right.
book while I was in your neck of the woods writing policy and procedure for a large debt buyer and completely revamped the entire technical policies based on what I learned in that particular book.
Sure. It's amazing how much details some of these guys will do just before they send you that. How much research or homework they'll do before they send you that email. They know other names of other people in your company. They've got a cell phone. They've got things like that to really try to make it believable.
The other
And
thing
so
people need to look at is known before, right? The known before policies and actually having your people trained by an organization that comes
right.
from the hacking realm in terms of putting some protection in place, and learning about what to look for in any given email or any given communication. If I remember correctly, as I was reading
Yes.
through some attack statistics recently, it was, I want to say 80% of attacks are initiated via social engineering. Now, at some point, there may be system penetration from a technology perspective, but most of that is originating, even going back and looking at the Sony hacks, right? When Sony Studios fell,
Right.
that was a social engineering attack. Eventually they
Yes.
penetrated the systems, but they used social engineering by which to acquire the information they needed for that penetration. They never actually
That's
like
right.
hacked them from a technology perspective. They just figured out somebody's password.
That's right. So I mean, you're right, and it's something that to have obviously your IT folks stay on top of, whether they're in house or you use an outside vendor. But absolutely, the phishing training is critical to try to keep your employees as that front line of defense, watching out for this sort of thing. Obviously, some things like multi-factor authentication, having a two-factor process to log in, just some of the basics, encrypting data at rest. There are a lot of things that can be done to try to button up. And then,
Are there any
like we said,
requirements for these policies, like in terms of having a PCI audit done or a SOC 1, SOC 2? Like, are there any, do some of these policies have that as a requirement?
we're definitely seeing a lot more hands-on underwriting approach from the cyber underwriters, whereas in the past they may have just looked at your revenues and a record count, and then they give you a number. Now they're asking a lot more detailed question about your policies and procedures. And yes, you may not have to have the PCI audits or SOC 2, but they'll ask questions about that. You may be able to get more favorable rates or higher coverage limits if you do have those type of safeguards in place and best practices.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And there are insurers that will now do some sort of external penetration tests. And before you can bind, they will say, hey, we need you to close this port. We need you to button up these vulnerabilities.
Interesting.
So they're looking at some things that they think could be red flags, and they want you to clean those up before actually binding the policy.
That's really
so there
interesting.
is sort of,
but as we talk about buying the policy, right? So like, as we kind of talk about the policies here, what kind, like, how are these policies being priced? Like, what is the price mechanism that's being, so we talked about the building blocks of the policy, but like, how is underlying pricing working?
Right. High level, it used to be really expensive. The pricing, at least for collection agencies in recent years, had gotten much more affordable. We knew that pendulum was going to swing back at some point, and now we are starting to see it swing back, especially in the wake of just the broader ransomware attacks. And so they are looking primarily still at revenues and record counts. Those are still, and of course, what limits of liability that you're asking for. It's certainly advisable to have, $1 million's a nice big round number, and that's probably what most people carry until a client contract requires higher limits, at which point, so the tail kind of wags the dog a little bit in terms of the limits, but obviously that affects pricing as well. And now, as I mentioned, just best practices and procedures to safeguard the data, those are some things that can help you obtain more favorable terms.
Very interesting. Well, I feel like I learned a lot about cyber policies today, and I spend a lot of time in this space. So I really want to thank you for, taking the time and kind of chatting with everybody about, really what's the bottom line behind these cyber policies.
That's right. It's certainly a moving target, and the marketplace for cyber for collectors and debt buyers has evolved a lot in the last year as well. So it'll be interesting to watch where it goes, but certainly never a dull moment on that front.
Absolutely. So for all of you that are watching today, I will have Ben tagged below here so that you can reach out to him directly and have a conversation if you have some cyber policy needs or additional questions or want to continue the conversation. We'll also both be responding to any questions, comments, or concerns that you want to post below. And for those of you that are not subscribed to the Receivables Info channel, please feel free to follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and share and participate in our content. We're always looking for new guests to bring on and new topics for us to cover with various experts and our friends around the industry. So really looking forward to the next one here and looking forward to seeing you in the near future, Ben. I know we got a chance to give high fives passing in the hallways at RMAI, but I'm sure now that the world is starting to come back to normal, we'll have an opportunity to see each other again in the near future.
That's right. It was good to kind of feel a little bit back to normal and see a lot of familiar faces at RMAI. So hope to see you down the road. Thanks very much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Take care.
Perfect, dude. That was awesome. That
Well
was
said.